Here we have three pretty similar cases that weren't really long enough to make their own videos, so they've been compiled into just one. All of these involve encounters with strange entities that may have been built rather than born. With that said, let's go ahead and look into the first of these reports that are in no particular order. Abduction by machine-like beings. This story starts on January 27, 1977, with a young man named Lee Parrish living in the small town of Prospect, Kentucky. He was 19 and recently graduated high school, and was now working as a truck driver for the family business, Parrish Supply. He was said to be over 6 feet tall and a bit husky, but was overall a very polite and quiet guy. Lee still lived with his mother, but had a girlfriend, Kathy, who he would frequently go out to visit in his free time. After finishing a TV show at Kathy's that night, he would decide to head home around 1 a.m. He gave her dog some treats on the way out the door and then hopped into his 1970s Jeepster V6 before lighting up a cigarette. He only lived about 7 minutes away by highway, and even though it was cold and there was a bit of snow on the ground, the roads were mostly clear, so he didn't expect the trip to take any longer than normal. While driving west on Highway 329 towards US 42, he would come to see a very strange object in the sky. It was 100 or 200 feet off the road and floating just above the tree line. It was rectangular in shape and appeared to be about 10 feet tall and 20 feet wide. It was very bright in the night sky and looked almost like a small setting sun. Even though it hurt his eyes to look directly at it, he couldn't help himself. Almost like he was unable to take his gaze off of it. Lee began to get scared, and didn't really know how he was managing to keep the car under control during all of this. He would get nearly underneath the object when the car radio suddenly went off. Then, without warning, the craft began to fly off at the speed of a jet, but made no sounds whatsoever. As it flew off to the northwest, it accelerated even faster, moving at an incredible speed. As he went back to focusing on the road, he would notice that his memory now felt a bit fuzzy, and his eyes burnt badly. Going to take a drag from his cigarette, he would come to see that it was just gone, and wasn't even in the ashtray. He got home at about 1:45 a.m., quickly realizing that his trip had somehow taken nearly 45 minutes. His mother was still awake, and went on to greet him at the door as he came inside. But as soon as she saw him up close, she would ask him, "What's wrong with your eyes?" Going to a mirror to see what she was talking about, Lee would find that his eyes were extremely red and bloodshot. The mother was so concerned that something did happen to her son, she later in the day contacted a local hypnotist. This hypnotist, Lawrence Allison, was well known in the area for helping UFO investigators. He thought that the case sounded interesting and soon called a couple of professionals, Don Elkins and Carla Ruckart, to come down and make an official report. Since this took place in the late 70s, many still used hypnosis as a method of retrieving lost memories. And after hearing of Lee's symptoms, Allison believed that hypnosis could be of help in this case as well. But Lee didn't seem to like this idea and actually took some convincing, with both Elkins and Allison explaining the whole technique to him. After a while, Lee relaxed and agreed to undergo the treatment, because in the end he really did want to know why the drive took so long. And that night, he would be put into a hypnotic state, recalling a very strange series of events. After leaving Kathy's house and coming to see the bright light above the highway, he would say that just for a split second he thought it was a flying fire, but he knew that this couldn't be the case. He would say that after this, it seemed like the car was moving on its own, but he didn't feel like he was controlling it. He wasn't even sure if it was actually on the road anymore. Then, the large hovering object suddenly went black, before lighting back up in a blinding white light. Lee felt absolutely nothing for several moments before he just appeared in a large circular white room with illuminated walls. The room looked to be 20 feet tall and wide, with the craft appearing larger on the inside than it did on the outside. Lee then came to see three bizarre large objects standing right in front of him. One was black, one red, and the last one white. The largest of these was on his left, the black one, and it was nearly 20 feet tall itself. It was a slab or flattened jug shape, and reminded him of the soldier silhouette shooting targets that the army would train with. but the head did seem rather small and was completely featureless. He couldn't tell what the exterior of this machine-like being was made of, but it appeared to be rough in some places and smooth in others. It sat on its flat bottom, seeming to only have one jointed arm-like appendage. The arm moved over to Lee and jabbed him both on the back and on the left side, which both hurt and terrified him. The arm of the creature felt both hot and cold at the same time, and it seemed like it was vibrating as well. Out of all three of the machine creatures, the black slab would frighten him the most. The second one was directly in front of him and looked to be about the same height as he was. It was a curved block shape with several more smaller block pieces on top. He believed that the two longer rectangular pieces to the side were its arms, but it never actually moved them. A triangle piece sat on the top center of the entity, and it appeared to be its head, although it was completely featureless as well. The entire thing appeared to glow, and Lee felt that it was the ruler of the other two creatures. The last one on his right side was much smaller than the other two and looked just like a red box, with Lee even calling it a Coke machine. It also had just one arm, but it wasn't jointed, seeming to be more like a kind of probe. It slowly came over as if reluctant to touch him, but after a moment it also jabbed him in the shoulder and then right above his ear. But this was much less painful than the jabs from the black slab and felt more like a small needle had punctured him, only stinging briefly. But after this, he began to feel quite cold, and it felt like the whole ship was rocking back and forth like a boat on the ocean. The small red machine then backed away from him and moved over to the white creature. It then seemed to either disappear behind it or somehow merge into the white one, as he could no longer see it in the room. The white machine then started making a rhythmic sound, kinda like a cross between scraping sandpaper and a person brushing their teeth. It then moved behind the large black slab creature and disappeared from sight as well. The black machine then scooted back several paces before simply vanishing altogether. Lee now noticed that the cold room was suddenly much warmer, and for some reason he felt a bit heavy, too. It was then that he was suddenly back in his Jeepster, driving next to a pond on a road close to his mother's house. He looked up to see the craft start to fly away, and about 5 seconds later, his car radio suddenly came back on. Although Lee never specifically said that they spoke to him telepathically, this is kind of how the researchers felt that they must have been communicating to him. He would say that he could almost feel their thoughts, and said that the red one felt scared, and he could tell that the white one was thinking about him. When asked why they abducted him and why it was thinking about him, Lee would tell them that they were checking on his chemical makeup and doing a physical checkup. He said they were curious about the way that he was Lee. He would add that he also felt like they would contact him again one day in the future. Oddly, just a couple days after this hypnosis session, it seems that the Jeepster's electrical system would go out to the point of needing extensive repairs. Lee would also complain of dizziness for a while after this, and even had some welts appear on his legs at some point. The investigators would also come to learn that this wasn't the first time that Lee had claimed to see a UFO. It seems that he had been interested in them for several years at this point, and both he and his girlfriend claimed to have seen them on multiple occasions. But Kathy would actually say that she thought they only wanted Lee for some reason, and that's why they never made contact when others were around him. His mother would also claim to have seen UFOs several different times as well, saying that the most extraordinary time was when it appeared just behind her house, making a noise like a, quote, sewing machine going full throttle. Lee would also add that he was interested in psychic phenomenon too, and even had strange things happen around him. As an example, he said that one night he was able to make an outdoor lamp turn on just from his will alone, even though it was unplugged at the time. Overall, the two investigators felt that Lee was of average intellect, was sincere, and seemed genuinely bothered by this strange encounter. They would go on to find that about 4 miles away from this incident, Dr. Burton Monroe, an APRO consultant, would hear of a sighting made on the very same night. It seems that one of his neighbors had their kids running home in terror, only for her to look out the window and see a large white disc with a dome on top hovering in the sky. Looking into this and Lee's sighting, Louisville's Bowman and Stanford Fields, as well as the Indianapolis Air Route Traffic Control Center would all be contacted. But none of these radar stations seemed to have picked up anything in the area that night. Thinking of the rectangular shape of the reported craft, they thought that it may have just been some kind of smaller plane with an ad banner. And they even contacted the nearest 5 agencies that flew these types of banners, just to find that none of them were actually in the area that night either. It seems that other researchers would come out to investigate him after this, and although no details would emerge, his story would always remain the same. So in the end, this case, like many others, would go on to just be a very strange and unsolved mystery. The Alien Beer Cans. This takes place out in Long Prairie, Minnesota, a very small town with a population of less than 4,000. Here we have another 19-year-old man, Jerry F. Townsend, a devout Christian and new radio host of KEYL, or Hot Rod Radio, a country music channel. On the night of October 23rd, around 7:15 p.m., he was returning home from a trip to the neighboring town of Little Falls, driving on Highway 27. After turning down a long curve in the road, he would come to see a strange, upright, rocket-like object resting on 3 fins right in the middle of the road. It was fairly large, looking to be about 30 or 40 feet tall and about 10 feet wide. He slowed down and got the idea to gently knock it over with his car for evidence. He feared that he would somehow take it with him, or at least get it to stay put while he got somebody else to come see it. But as he got about 20 feet away from the object, his car began to stall and his radio went out completely. He tried to get it all restarted, but the engine wouldn't even turn over at this point. The car came to a stop just 20 feet in front of the strange rocket-like craft. Thinking that he may just be able to push it over by hand, he got out of his vehicle. But he would only take a few steps before freezing in amazement. 3 small, brownish creatures, no more than 6 inches tall, appeared from behind the object, lining up in front of him and facing him. They were in the shape of beer cans, and looked to move around mainly on 2 small pencil-like legs, but they did seem to have a third leg in the back they used to stabilize themselves. They each also had 2 tiny arms which reminded him of matchsticks. They didn't have any distinguishing features, and all looked exactly the same. They had no eyes, but it felt as if they were watching him closely. Although they did look robotic, they seemed to move like they were truly alive. Jerry would say, "I was going to grab one, but then I figured that if they could stop my car and put out my lights, they could do something awful to me." He quickly gave up on the idea of knocking the rocket over as well, seeing this as being an even riskier move. He felt as if they had been staring at each other in silence for quite a while, but in reality it had only been about 3 minutes. The small creatures began to move away. Just then, the bottom of the rocket began to glow with a colorless light, and the 3 beer can beings disappeared into the light one by one. Just a few seconds later, the entire rocket started to hum, and Jerry decided to retreat back to his car. The hum grew to the point that it hurt his ears, and then it soon began to lift up into the sky, all while emitting an extremely bright light from the bottom. He later described this, saying that it looked very much like a flashlight being lifted off of a table. It was nearly as bright as daytime outside, before suddenly the light went off altogether. The craft was now about 400 feet straight up in the air. Suddenly, his radio came back on, and the car started by itself. He would say that he didn't even touch the key. With the rocket now out of sight, Jerry hopped back out of his car and looked for any evidence on the road that may remain. But unfortunately, there was no sign that the rocket had actually been there at all. His heart was pounding, and his legs felt rubbery, so he decided he'd better just continue with his drive back home. He wondered if anyone would even believe what he had just seen, later saying, "I was sure of 2 things. The rocket, it towered above the trees along the road, was a spaceship of some kind, and the 3 objects that came out of it were creatures, like nothing else in the animal world I've ever seen. They definitely were not people as I know them." Before long, he decided that he had better report this all to the sheriff's office, and sped up his car to about 90 miles an hour. He burst into the police station and reported the events so rapidly that Sheriff James Bain and police officer Laverne Lubitz said that it took considerable effort to get him to calm down. The two police officers noted that he did seem quite frightened, and he was altogether excited, nervous, shaky, and somewhat pale. Jerry told them, "I am not crazy, nor am I drunk. Neither am I ignorant." With this being such a small town, the police already knew him and agreed with this statement. They all knew that he wasn't a drinker, was pretty level-headed, and was even the counselor to some of their kids at Bible camp. The two officers now wanted to go check out the site for themselves, but it took them a little while to get Jerry on board with the idea. It seems that once they were all out there, they would almost immediately see a strange, bizarre orange light with a yellow tail-like structure moving around in the northern sky. And here there would actually be a couple of different versions of how this story played out. One would say that they all went over to the landing site and again found nothing. However, some researchers have been told that they would find 3 oily streaks along the road. They were only a few inches across and about a yard long. But now nobody seems to know which of these is actually true. The original reports may be lost to time, as we're just not sure if they did find it during this investigation or if they went back during the daytime. We really just don't know. But with that said, one report even has a quote from Sheriff Bain, in which he says, "I don't know what they were, but I've looked at a lot of roads and never saw anything like them before." The famous ufologist, Coral Lorenzen, would also investigate a bit by phone, calling different people around to hear about his reputation. It seems that everyone thought of him as an honest person, and no one around town thought that he would have much of a reason to lie. It seems that Jerry would even send a letter to J. Allen Hynek as well, who worked for Project Blue Book at this time. And although he did comment that the case was interesting, he decided not to file an official report. It seems that he did contact radar stations near to Long Prairie, but didn't find that they had actually detected any objects in the area at that time. But soon the story would start appearing in newspapers in the surrounding areas, making him quite well known in a pretty short amount of time. Some said that he was a hero for witnessing something like that and then actually going to the police to report it. However, others felt differently, saying that he must just have a very fantastic imagination. And then some just plain ridiculed him. Before long, he was receiving a ton of prank mail and crank phone calls too. Soon people from neighboring towns were even coming up to him on the street and calling him a drunk or a liar. One national magazine would straight up say that the entire thing was imagined by Jerry, which he of course didn't like reading, and he soon refused to talk to any more reporters about this event, even saying, "These are the facts, such as they occurred. I know that it is a crazy story, but if you do not believe me, too bad for you." UFO investigators were still trying to get a hold of him at this point, but he just wasn't very willing to talk to them either, figuring that it was just some kind of plan to make fun of him. One radio station would eventually have him on, but they had to promise him that they would keep a receptive atmosphere and wouldn't mock him. After this broadcast, it seems that other people in the area would start coming forward with their own sightings as well. On the very same night that Jerry ran into the 3 robot cans, a few boys had been hunting raccoons and seen a strange light in the sky that they just never reported until now. Another boy, about 14 years old, known as Blessings, would see something strange while using his father's telescope out in Minneapolis. He saw what he described as a glowing inverted sombrero shape floating across the sky, and he would actually tell his parents about this just 15 minutes before Jerry saw the rocket, but at the time, the parents just shrugged it off. They would eventually come forward with this story later on after hearing of Jerry's encounter on the radio. Others around town started going to the police, reporting their own UFO sightings to them too, but most of them insisted on remaining anonymous. Overall, many believe Jerry's story, but it just appears that no proper investigation was ever performed, and this is what upsets most people about the case. Many wish that the police at least collected some of the oily substance found on the road for analysis, but others also point out that the police shouldn't have to be the ones to investigate these cases in the first place. Some feel like the Air Force and Project Blue Book just kind of took the easy road with this one, and just labeled the entire thing as a psychological episode to avoid doing a full investigation. But to be fair, there were just so many sightings around this time in history that it was just nearly impossible for every case to be fully researched. But either way, Jerry seemed to somewhat regret his encounter, and did not enjoy all of the ridicule he got afterwards. And he never was exactly sure what the small creatures or the rocket were either. When asked if he thought they were extraterrestrials, he replied with, "I don't believe in it as a Christian." Encounter with two rectangular robot creatures. On the morning of September 26, 1968, a 6-year-old industrial chemist and resident of Vila Balmer, Brazil, Henrique Schneider, woke up early and went to check on a ceramic furnace fire that he had started the day before. These types of furnaces needed to be kept at a specific temperature and would have to be checked somewhat frequently. After he was satisfied that everything was still burning well, he walked a few steps away to relieve himself in some bushes. He then lit up a cigarette and looked up to the sky, immediately noticing a small aircraft flying just 15 feet away from him. It was conical in shape and glowed from the underside. It was roughly 12 feet tall and about 6 to 8 feet across on the bottom. He suddenly felt paralyzed and was unable to move as he watched the craft land on 3 tripod-like legs that were less than 3 feet long. The light from the underside now brightly lit up the area around it, and soon some kind of ramp or conveyor belt extended down to just a few inches above the ground. On the ramp, 2 rectangular entities, appearing about 4.5 feet tall and just 1.5 feet wide, sat there motionless. Schneider nervously asked them what they were doing there, only for a voice in his head to tell him that they were investigating the cause of a strange smoke they had detected. It seems that he had actually been burning tires the night before, and this caused a very intense fire with dark smoke. He believed that this may have been what caught the bizarre creature's attention. After this, he would speak to him for another 10 minutes, asking them a variety of different questions. But during this time, he was still paralyzed and felt that he couldn't take his eyes off these strange rectangular beings. He would ask them how they ate food, and was told, impregnation, natural diet, energy, not like you. Just as a note, when looking at this from a chemist's point of view, impregnation seems to refer to putting chemicals inside of another material. He would ask them how their ship moved, and they would say, by attraction, 36,000 or 360,000 revolutions per second. They also told him that they came from another star system and were traveling on a very specific route, but made a detour to come check out the strange smoke and heat source. The creatures told them that they each had a different function, but only one was the leader who governed them. It was also mentioned that there was some sort of occupant with its own function inside of one of these machines, and it couldn't come out for some unknown reason. But soon they seemed to stop answering his questions, and the scene went completely silent, and the ramp began to retract with the 2 rectangular beings being pulled back inside of the craft. He was now able to look away and move around again, now taking in every detail of the small cone-shaped craft he could see. It was an aluminum gray color and looked to have 3 blue lights or window-type things on the side. He only thought that they may have been windows because he thought he may have seen a 3rd rectangular creature through one of them, but he wasn't entirely sure. When the ramp finished retracting, he heard a sparking sound, and soon a door covered the opening with a light thud. The cone craft immediately began to make a high-pitched whistling sound like a power drill as it shot up into the air about 200 feet up. It hovered for just a split second before starting to spin rapidly, with blue concentric rings appearing on the bottom of the craft. It then began to shoot sparks like welding equipment and tilted to the south before shooting off in an instant. It seems that it shot off so fast that it created a suction-like effect on the area, pulling tiles off of his roof and pulling him towards the landing site. Once the air settled, he would quickly come to notice that the area was now quite hot and smelled like burnt kerosene. He would report this to the Brazilian Society for the Study of Flying Discs and had an investigator show up to the scene just a day later. They would find a 2-foot circle of burnt grass, and inside of this circle they found 3 smaller circles just a few inches across, with the researchers assuming these must have been from the landing legs. When looking at his roof, they would confirm that 8 to 10 tiles had indeed been ripped off, looking like they had been lifted into the air, just like how he had described the suction from the departing craft. It seems that this same day he would come to find that his truck wasn't working at all. He would find that the battery, starter, distributor, and dynamo, which is an old-school alternator, all had gone out at the same time. Several days later, 3 other investigators would come out to photograph the whole encounter area, and said that it still smelled like a strange burning odor even then. Schneider would claim that the smell didn't completely dissipate for a few weeks after this. And then a few months later, he and his son and a couple of his friends would all report seeing another strange light in the sky, although this one was much more distant. Then a whole 5 years later, another investigator, Carlos Varasan, would come out to visit and research the encounter. He would say that the landing site was still visible even this many years later, with the grass still struggling to grow in that small area. Even after Schneider repeated the story to many different investigators, none would ever really find any flaws in his story. He was highly respected in his community, and no one seemed to believe that he would have any reason to lie about any of this. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you like this type of content. Be sure to leave a comment too. I'm always interested in what you all think about these cases as well. This show is also available on most podcast platforms if audio format's more your thing. For those of you wanting to show your support, I do have a Patreon and channel membership page up where you can get these videos early and ad-free. With that said, I really do appreciate all the support I get from you guys. And a big thanks goes out to my current members. This was Matt, and I want to believe.